Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really getting into something huge, Mount Sinai. I mean, this place is just absolutely central to the Exodus story and its impact, well, it's still felt today, isn't it?
It really is. And, as we unpack it, it's important to remember that while everyone agrees Sinai is vital, some of the specifics, the history, the geography, there are different viewpoints. There's quite a bit of scholarly discussion still happening.
Right, exactly. So for this deep dive, we've pulled together, well, quite a range of sources. We've got theological angles, archaeological debates, the biblical texts themselves, of course, and even some travelogue and historical stuff.
Yeah, a real mix.
Our goal really is to pull out the most important ideas about Mount Sinai and understand why it still has this hold on us after thousands of years. So let's dive in.
Okay. Let's start with the main event, I suppose. The encounter at Sinai itself is laid out in Exodus. What really jumps out at you from this description?
Oh, wow. For me, it's just the sheer intensity. Exodus 19, it paints this, well, unbelievable picture. God descending onto the mountain. You've got thunder, lightning, this incredibly loud trumpet sound, a really thick cloud. And then the mountain itself is just on fire, smoking like a furnace. And it says the whole thing was shaking violently.
Yeah, not subtle at all.
Not subtle, no.
Yeah,
Wasn't a quiet meeting.
definitely not. And this huge display, it had a profound effect on the Israelites. Both Hebrews and Exodus talk about this deep fear and awe they felt.
Yeah.
It actually got so intense they asked Moses, could God maybe not speak directly to them anymore? It was just too much, too terrifying.
I can only imagine standing there witnessing that.
Yeah.
And Hebrews 12 adds that detail, that command.
Right.
Even an animal couldn't touch the mountain.
Right? It would be stone.
Stoned. It just hammers home how sacred, how off limits. God's immediate presence was right then and there.
Absolutely. And even Moses himself, the leader, Hebrews says he was afraid, trembling at the sight.
Wow.
But in the midst of all this drama, this awe and fear, something absolutely foundational happened. This is where God offered them a covenant.
Okay, the covenant. Explain that a bit.
Well, basically, a covenant is a formal agreement. It's binding between two parties. Here, it's between God and the Israelites, a defining moment for their relationship, really.
Gotcha. And the core of that covenant was the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
Given to Moses right there on the mountain.
Exactly. He was up there for quite a while, actually, 40 days and 40 nights.
40 days.
Yeah. Receiving not just the law, those 10 commandments, but also really detailed instructions for building the tabernacle.
Ah, okay. The tabernacle instructions, too.
Now, something really interesting is God's stated intention for Israel right there at Sinai. Exodus says he wanted them to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. What does that suggest to you?
Kingdom of priests.
Right.
That sounds like... Well, like the whole nation was meant to connect directly with God and maybe represent him to other nations, like a collective priestly role.
That's a great way to put it. It wasn't just about individual priests. The entire community had this potential role.
That's quite profound.
It really is. And holy nation means set apart, right? Distinct, belonging to God, meant to follow his ways. You see echoes of this later, actually. In the New Testament, 1 Peter calls believers in Christ a royal priesthood and a holy nation, too. So that Sinai idea carries forward.
So it wasn't just a light show then. These events at Sinai were, well, formative. The birth of Israel as a nation, defined by this relationship with God, centered on the covenant and the law.
Foundational is the word, definitely. Our sources really stress this. For Jewish tradition and history, Sinai is the moment. It's when Israel became a people, received God's instruction, the Torah, which was meant to guide their entire way of life.
And it had ongoing consequences, right? It wasn't just a historical marker.
No, not at all. The sources point out that Israel's later history, their ups and downs, was often interpreted based on how faithful they were to that Sinai covenant and law.
Their struggles were seen as linked to turning away from those instructions.
Often, yes. That's a recurring theme. And, Sinai wasn't just for Moses.
Oh.
Later on, the prophet Elijah, he also has this major encounter with God at the very same place, Horeb, which is another name for Sinai.
Ah, okay. So it remained this significant place of divine encounter.
Exactly. Which leads to something really fascinating in the New Testament. The book of Hebrews makes this big contrast between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion.
Okay, yeah, I've seen that referenced. What's the core difference being highlighted there?
Well, Hebrews uses them symbolically. Sinai represents the old covenant, the one made with Moses. It's associated with, that fear we talked about, the rules, the restrictions, God's presence being somewhat inaccessible.
Right, the don't touch the mountain vibe.
Precisely. It highlights the consequences of breaking the law, the weight of it.
And Zion. What does that represent?
Mount Zion symbolizes the new covenant through Jesus Christ. It's presented as like a heavenly reality, a place of joy, of direct access to God because of Jesus, the mediator.
So a totally different kind of relationship.
Completely. It's about grace, approachability, not the kind of fear that marked the Sinai experience. It's a really powerful shift.
That really is a huge shift. From terrifying holiness to joyful communion.
Yes. And this idea of a powerful personal encounter. It's not just biblical figures. Think about someone like Blaise Pascal.
The scientist and philosopher.
That's the one. Our sources mention his memorial, this record of a deeply mystical experience he had, where he felt he encountered God directly. He even saw reading scripture as potentially leading to that kind of personal meeting.
Wow, that's fascinating. It takes this huge historical event and connects it right down to individual transformative experiences.
It does. And just thinking symbolically for a moment, mountains themselves often carry weight, don't they?
Yeah, stability maybe, God being unchanging.
Exactly, stability, permanence. But then you also have that idea mentioned in the sources too about faith moving mountains.
Right. Showing God's power or the power available through faith.
So there's layers of meaning there.
Okay, so we've really established just how incredibly significant Sinai is in the story.
Yeah.
But then there's the big question, isn't there?
Yeah.
Where is it? Geographically speaking.
Ah, yes, the million-dollar question. And the short answer is, well, we're not entirely sure. While its importance is undisputed, the actual location of the biblical Mount Sinai is, let's say, debated. Quite hotly sometimes.
Okay, so what are the main contenders? The sources mention a traditional view.
Right. The long-held traditional location puts it in the Sinai Peninsula in modern-day Egypt. That's where you find Jebel Musa, often identified as Mount Sinai.
And St. Catherine's Monastery is there.
Exactly. Built back in the 6th century AD, right at the foot of Jebel Musa, its presence has really cemented that tradition over centuries. And significantly, it's where the Codex Sinaiticus, one of our oldest, most complete Bible manuscripts, was preserved.
That definitely gives it historical weight. But you said there are other theories.
Oh, yes. There are alternative theories. A major one is the Arabia theory. This suggests the real Sinai is actually in modern-day Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. Okay.
Specifically, a mountain called Jabal Aloz is often proposed.
And this is where it gets a bit more controversial, perhaps. I know some sources mention researchers like Ron Wyatt. What kind of evidence do they point to?
Well, proponents of the Jabal al-Lawz site point to several things they believe line up with the biblical account. There's a very large rock that's visibly split in two.
The rock Moses struck for water.
That's the interpretation, yes. They also point to what look like ancient altar structures, some with carvings, petroglyphs that seem to depict bulls or calves.
Ah, linking to the golden calf incident.
Potentially. And they also highlight evidence of a massive ancient campsite nearby, arguing it's large enough to have held the Israelites.
Interesting. And what's the main argument for looking in Arabia in the first place? Why not the Sinai Peninsula?
A key verse often cited is Exodus 3.1. It says Moses was tending sheep for his father-in-law, Jethro, who was a priest of Midian near the mountain of God.
Okay.
And historically, Midian is generally placed in northwest Arabia. So the argument goes, if Jethro and Midian were in Arabia, then the mountain of God, Sinai, should likely be there too.
That makes geographical sense if Midian was indeed there. Are there other proposed spots besides Egypt and Arabia?
Yes. Our sources mention at least one other significant candidate, Har Karkum, which is in the Negev Desert, part of modern Israel. That location is based more on archaeological finds in that specific area.
So Egypt, Arabia, Negev, quite a spread.
It is. And adding another layer, the Bible itself seems to use different names for possibly the same mountain. Yeah. We see Sinai, but also Horeb. Sometimes Mount Paran is mentioned in proximity.
They do Horeb, right? I remember Elijah went to Horeb.
Exactly. And there's a verse in Deuteronomy 1.2 that says it's an 11 days journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by way of Mount Seir.
Okay. And the significance of that is?
Well, some scholars use that verse to argue against a location deep in Arabia, like Jabal al-Lawz. They feel 11 days isn't enough time to cover that distance if Sinai Horeb was that far east.
Ah, I see. Using travel times mentioned in the text itself, it's complex. So with all these different theories, all this debate, does it ultimately matter where the mountain actually is? One source really posed that question.
And I think the consensus generally is that while finding the exact spot would be, historically fascinating.
Sure, incredibly so.
The real significance, The theological weight, the meaning of what happened at Sinai, that remains central no matter the precise coordinates.
Yeah.
The encounter, the covenant, the giving of the law, that's what truly endures.
That puts it in perspective. The power of the event isn't tied to a pin on a map 3,500 years later.
Exactly right. The experience and its legacy are the key.
Now, thinking about that traditional site, Jebel Musa in Egypt, can people actually go there today? Visit it?
Yes, absolutely. It's a very popular place for both religious pilgrims and general tourists. People come from all over the world.
What's the experience like for someone who makes that trip?
Well, the classic thing to do is the climb. Many people start late at night. Yeah, so they can reach the summit just before dawn to watch the sunrise. Apparently, it's spectacular. Just incredible views over the whole Sinai Range.
I can imagine.
And there's a small chapel up there on the summit. And of course, down at the base, there's the Monastery of St. Catherine, which is a major historical site in itself.
We mentioned that. Worth seeing too, I assume.
Definitely. With its ancient manuscripts and long history.
If someone listening is thinking, maybe I'd like to do that, do the sources offer any practical tips?
They do. Generally, the cooler months are better for the climb, say November to February. It can get surprisingly cold up top, especially before dawn.
Good to know. Layering clothes sounds essential.
Yes, comfortable shoes, layers are key. The climb takes several hours, and while there are plenty of guides and organized tours available, which can be helpful,
Yeah.
some sources suggest they aren't absolutely necessary if you're reasonably fit and comfortable with hiking independently.
Okay, useful info. So as we wrap up this deep dive on Mount Sinai, what are the absolute core takeaways we should leave with?
I think the main thing is Sinai's central role as the place where God met his people, Israel, in this incredibly dramatic way.
Right. The encounter.
That's where the covenant was established, defining their identity, and where the law, the Ten Commandments, was given as a guide for their relationship with God and each other. It was just this pivotal moment of divine presence and relationship building.
And even with all the fascinating debate about where exactly it happened,
Right.
the theological weight, the historical impact of Exodus and the events at Sinai, those are undeniable and endure.
Absolutely. The what happened is far more significant than the precise where.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to chew on. Think about that original Sinai experience, that mix of awe, maybe even terror, in God's direct presence. How does that shape your understanding of God's holiness today?
And then contrast that with the new covenant. Hebrews talks about that promise of access, of a different kind of relationship through Christ. Just like Moses, like Pascal perhaps, had their encounters. What does it mean for you to approach the divine in your own life? Something to reflect on, definitely.